Thank you so much, panel. Very interesting. I took some notes on that as well. So, okay, we've got the next panel. I'm actually moderating. So hopefully you're not sick of me yet. I'm going to leave this mic here.
All right, great. Thank you very much. All right. Take us.
Okay, we're going to be talking about technology and SDGs and how can technology be used for digital transformation. So with me, I've got these great guests on the panel, Catherine Stihler, Annie Newman, Mark Young, Marta Belcher, and great to have you guys here. And of course, technology can be a force for good. We've seen it happen in our lifetime. And of course, it can be propel us to SDGs and the achievements that many would like to see. But what exactly does that look like? And so I guess, and let's just kind of make this casual, like we're having coffee and everybody can jump in whenever you want, and we'll take questions, of course, as well. Now, there was a report earlier this year entitled Technology for a Secure, Sustainable, and Superior Future. It estimated that reaching the SDGs by 2030 could cost $195 trillion. Can technology reduce the cost of achieving SDGs? Anybody feel free to jump in.
Yes.
Oh, this is going to be a quick panel. Would you like to elaborate on that, please?
I obviously tongue in cheek. I just think that it can reduce it, but you've seen the arc with every technology that it's more expensive at the beginning. The more people who get in, the more iterations that we have, the more those costs will be driven down. And David Treat was saying earlier about the importance of use cases. I think that the more we see that, the more people will get into the development of the technologies, the more the costs will be driven down, and the more the technologies will proliferate and the benefits will be shared by more and more people.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think, it's not just the cost, it's also the efficiency and the efficacy. So just to give you one example, just today, as I'm sure has been talked about many times on this stage, there was the announcement that GBBC is working with the UN World Food Program, along with Filecoin Foundation, Accenture, and Bayer, and others in this room, to really make sure that as we're addressing those SDGs, the money and the resources are being effectively tracked, and that really increasing the efficacy of this program in addition to reducing the cost.
Mm-hmm. And there's also a way, I think, when you're talking about SDGs, about keeping governments to account for what they've signed up to. So I think there's also that thing about accountability where technology can help with that. I also think that the SDGs, in terms of citizens understanding what this means in day-to-day life, and also at a more local level, I think there's something there too. So pass to Annie.
No, I would just add that I think those costs would be incredibly front-loaded. That's not to minimize kind of that backload, but especially from a government perspective, so much of that is actually in expanding the infrastructure we currently have to allow for people and resources that actually understand and are willing to implement that technology. Once that happens, I think there is a much easier case to be made to the taxpayers, to the folks in charge, whoever that might be, that's worth it, and that there's kind of really case studies to show.
Yeah. Which technologies do you think would be the most helpful? Would this be blockchain, AI, data, connectedness? I mean, so much of the world is still not connected. Is that where we have to start?
Well, yes, but I think that what's really interesting. I mean, we gathered a year ago, and we didn't talk at all last year about AI, and we're sitting here this year, and it's like AI is everywhere and everything, and we're seeing a law firm that's probably there, that is dealing with all of this. So I do think that how we approach this, what we think about, how we communicate. But I think AI, I mean, it was before when we were thinking about the SDGs, we're thinking about mobile technology and how that was affecting folks in remote areas that could never access that technology before. Now we're looking at, well, how can we create, certainly from a Creative Commons perspective, a new commons of knowledge and creativity unheard of when Creative Commons was created 22 years ago. I think that's the potential. The challenge is, how are we going to look at this in terms of the risks and opportunities, the challenges and the opportunities, and how are we going to get that right when the technology is speeding ahead, but the regulatory pathway is really trying to catch up and think about what to do very practically. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I come at this from like a very AI-centered lens, but one issue that we really run into in government, that I don't think government is the only blocker here, is data centralization. Our data is currently right now totally unprepared for the technology that we now have available to us. There is so much front work and frankly very tedious work to be done by governments and by large corporations to really be able to use the technology to the fullest. So something I think about a lot is like, how can we both manage anxieties and manage risks around that technology while simultaneously straightening our own house out so that we can actually use it and not losing public interest and not losing public faith that we can employ these really well.
Yeah, I'll take your question from I'm going to focus on the term you said, benefit. So we've talked a lot today about trust. And so I'm going to kind of start at the end and say that there are various technologies that I think that could enhance that trust. And I start with IoT, for example, which will give us more data to manage. So now we've got data. AI can provide insights from that data, leading to blockchain, which can provide trust of that data. So I kind of see that in a linear progression, ultimately winding up with better trust in all of those systems with blockchain at the tail end. And I commend to you a 1996 book, Trust, written by Francis Fukuyama, if you want to get into the details of how that process can work.
So they all working together, kind of overlapping all these technologies.
But I do think you should read that book. I actually went to hear Francis Fukuyama in 1996, and I've got a signed copy of that very book. So I'm so pleased you said that.
And it's called Trust.
Trust, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Catherine is ahead of the curve as always. Just like building on these points, I think one of the things that is a theme here is, the future involves a lot of centralization. For example, what Annie's talking about, right, is all of these data sets that are actually quite at risk because they're highly centralized. And one of the things Mark is talking about here is AI. If you think about AI and sort of what that future looks like, if you go down a path where the only people who are controlling this technology are the people with these massive amounts of GPUs, because of the compute power that it takes for AI, then you have a world that is highly, highly centralized, right? In which really people who have this immense power that comes from this technology are just a few people. But instead, if you can use decentralized technologies to instead, for example, similar to what the Filecoin network does for decentralized file storage, which is something that could address the problems Annie's talking about, if you can also do that for decentralized compute, right? Then you end up in a world where that technology is much more accessible broadly, and it's not just the people who can handle the massive amount of centralized computing power that it takes to run these models.
Yeah.
More accessible and more resilient.
Yeah.
And since you're talking about these major data centers, I did see a story this week, Microsoft's use of water.
Yeah.
Since they acquired or made the $10 billion investment in OpenAI, is up 34%.
Yeah.
So that doesn't quite fit into the SDG mold. How do we square that all out?
Well, when it comes to things like, so this is very similar to the problem of sort of giant centralized compute and also giant centralized storage are very similar and related issues. And so right now you have this sort of version of the centralized web where all of this data is being stored really, if you go to a website, any website, that data is almost certainly being stored by either Google, or Microsoft. There really are only a couple of companies, and we're really kind of living our whole lives through those companies. And what we'll see is Amazon, AWS will go down and suddenly mass swaths of the web are down for hours. It really shows the problem of this, lack of resilience from having just a few centralized players. And you can actually build a much more efficient model if instead of doing that, you do what we do on the Filecoin network, which is much more efficient, which is that we actually combine the storage capacity of many people's computers all over the world. There are sort of extra storage capacity and combine that into almost like a supercomputer network. And we use that that as an alternative to an AWS, this decentralized alternative. So similarly, you can do similar decentralized models that involve compute that I think can ultimately be more efficient.
Yeah, I'll say the same thing, that for the Ethereum network, you can find and see the data online that when Ethereum went from proof of work to proof of stake, 99.98% reduction in energy consumption for running of that protocol.
I also think, from a policy or like a public policy perspective, I think it's really incumbent on governments and organizations and the people in this room to be very thoughtful and deliberate about both internal communication and just essentially, for lack of a better word, the order of rollout here and what people see being affected first. I think that's a really hard ask. And in the context of your question, that the natural answer are some pretty unsexy things like agriculture, like sustainable infrastructure in cities, sustainable sewage even. That's not very fun, and no governor likes to talk about that. But there is a pretty massive responsibility, and I think it is incumbent on the organizations and the advocates in this room and here this week to continue to pressure there, because I don't think that's where government wants to go.
Yeah, and I think to the point about data, something that we're working on at Creative Commons is trying to make sure that climate data is open and accessible. And we've got a particular program at the moment that's really focused. We've got our open climate campaign. And then part of this is about open climate data. And so much, I think there's a statistic, is it 55% of, or 45% of climate research is hidden behind a paywall. And yet a lot of that is paid for by our taxpayers' money. So not only are we thinking about data storage and how we are looking at that, we're also thinking about how do we make that data open? I mean, you're talking about that, Annie, but how do we make that more open and accessible? Not just in the climate space, which is clearly a key part of what we're thinking about with sustainable development goals, but in a whole host of plethora of other things. We've got an open culture program. So much of our cultural heritage is also not accessible in our digital world today. How do we change mindsets? And frankly, a lot of it's around culture too, to make that accessible and open so we can solve the most pressing problems that we're facing as humanity. And that's something we're thinking a lot about at Creative Commons.
What do you think the resistance is to that? Is it lack of knowledge on the part of lawmakers, that just the mainstream doesn't totally understand all the applications of blockchain? I mean, what's behind this slowness? Because the technology is really pretty amazing.
Yeah, and it's there, and we see that today. And kind of, I think sometimes there's a real culture about how we share, and I think that's something that we've been trying to deal with and tackle with at Creative Commons, about our better sharing agenda. How can we share better, and how can we do that in a way that's inclusive and pro-social and makes a difference in our world? So there's a cultural aspect. I think some folks who are working in, say, the cultural heritage, which is museums, galleries, libraries, archives, some of it is just hesitancy and risk averseness and thinking about legality about sharing. And so how can we help and support to do things differently? So there's a whole host there. And cultural heritage is, I think I was speaking to somebody last night at the dinner who we were talking about Indian cultural heritage and preservation. Something I think is super important. And how can we do that together so that we can be a more enriched humanity? Because if we don't, the risk is we're going to be more closed, less culture will be shared, less knowledge is shared, and that's not a society or it's not good for humanity if that's a route that we end up going down.
Yeah. It seems like NFTs would be a good application for some of that as well. So go ahead.
So I just wanted to, I think I simplify this in a kind of a psychological way. I think there are really three reasons for the resistance. One is loss aversion. Does anybody know the psychological characteristic of loss aversion? We fear losing something more than we anticipate gaining something else. So I think there's a little bit of that. Then there's the inertia that we've talked about. It's not the way I've always done it, therefore I don't want to do it a new way now. And finally, there's cognitive dissonance. When you show me information that doesn't match with my values or my practices, I immediately reject it. And I think, present company excluded, it's amazing how many people do not recognize that in themselves and in their governmental institutions. It's hard to innovate. This stuff is hard work. We do it every day. So we're kind of used to that psychological anxiety when we don't know all the answers. I think there's an awful lot of people who have been very successful in their industries that there is no way they're going to adopt something new if it jeopardizes what they've already built.
Yeah, I think these culture points are absolutely right. I think partly because of this culture, government is fundamentally like not made to transition into new technologies at the scale. I mean, our administration has been in office for 7 months. I think we've made more progress on convergence tech, on AI specifically, than a lot of other states. And I credit that in large part because my boss, Governor Shapiro, is there every single day telling lawyers to get out of the way, telling procurement to get out of the way. And that's literally the governor, and not all of them are going to do that for all of the reasons that you just described. Government is not made to do these things. We talk about sharing at the most basic level of trying to open source technology. I mean, we've been in a battle for like 8 months. So it's just not right. And I think it's not often that we have someone at the top who both is willing to take that time to remove those blockers, but also doesn't struggle with these cultural effects of trying to listen to other people that know more than they do, that maybe is young enough to understand some of these things. I shouldn't say young enough, but you know what I mean? Reads the news enough to understand some of these things, and has an interest in it. And so I think I find some comfort in this space in that, like, so much of that is just so human. Like, it's just so human that someone just doesn't want to listen to someone that knows more than them because they don't.
So I'm going to challenge just one thing that you said. So let me just throw out 3 data points. She's absolutely right. And I associate myself with her remarks about how government finds it difficult to innovate. The supercomputing industry, the global supercomputing industry would not exist if it were not for the United States intelligence community.
Yeah.
Do you know where Siri got its start? It was a Navy project with DARPA. And of course, the Onion router, also a Navy project that was initiated by DARPA and then turned over to the private sector. So I completely agree, except when someone just gets curious and, like the governor, drives the change.
Yeah, I'd also add, I think that's a great point, and I'd also add emergency response to that. In that emergencies, I think, can really catapult the use of this new technology, and by nature eliminate some of the like horrific legal and procurement barriers that government finds in the way. I think with AI and a lot of convergence tech specifically, that becomes an additional ethical layer, because a lot of those emergencies where you might use this then comes into privacy, then comes into bias, and it becomes much harder to use it as an opportunity to try a new thing.
The emergency point is a really good one. One of the places where you really saw, for example, cryptocurrency really utilized to great effect was in the hours after the invasion of Ukraine. Suddenly, the government of Ukraine put up a wallet and was receiving millions and millions of dollars instantaneously across the world without having to wait for anything, right? It could all happen instantly. And so you really saw that government embracing it. And I would add, though, I think one of the main, in addition to what has been said, I think one of the main barriers is that a lot of people think of blockchain technologies as being purely financial. And in reality, what this technology does is it enables you to program your money. It enables you to write programs that let you do things that are far beyond just finance. And that is something that is, I think, not well understood. So getting out the message that this is really about building a better version of the web more broadly, this isn't just a financial technology, is really important.
Yeah, and it's really got a lot of consumer benefits as well. I mean, tracking and tracing all kinds of products that they can know where they were sourced, or, maybe food recalls. I mean, all kinds of things. Now, I do hear a lot of talk about fear about digital assets and government knowing where I'm spending my money, and am I spending my money someplace that the government at that particular time doesn't agree with. Maybe that is something also. How do you balance the accountability and the use of technology, which is convenient, versus big brother-ish?
Yeah.
So I think that this is a thing that comes up a lot in the context of CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. And I think there is I think one thing is you can't really think of digital assets and blockchain technology as being sort of one thing or the other when it comes to privacy, because it can be both. It can be sort of on a huge spectrum in terms of how you implement these technologies, in terms of whether they're private. So on one side of the spectrum, what you have is privacy coins like Zcash, and those privacy coins enable you to make transactions in a way that is private, and that isn't publicly recorded on a blockchain. Then you have things in the middle like Bitcoin, where you have a public ledger, but it's pseudonymous. It's not anonymous, but pseudonymous. And then you have the far end, which is central bank digital currencies, which is where you actually do have governments implementing this. And, you know, I think reasonable minds can differ on that topic. And I think different central bank digital currencies can be implemented in different ways, but at their worst and at the far end of the spectrum would be central bank digital currencies where you actually, the government has the ability to surveil all of these transactions, and where the government also has the ability to censor those transactions, to take away money, right, instantaneously. So in other words, this technology really enables a giant spectrum when it comes to privacy. And it's really important that people understand that it's not one thing or the other, and that we have a choice in where we implement that level of privacy.
I think when you're describing that, Marta, you're absolutely right. But Jane, I think you're talking about fear as in a broad sense as well. And if I think about AI just now and the fearfulness and the kind of moral panic that it seems to be, and some of that's legitimate, some of the things around it, around accountability, responsibility, absolutely, and safety, yeah. But there's also the other side, which is if we are not careful with that balance, yes, there's fearfulness, but there's also such an incredible opportunity in terms of innovation. And if we don't get that balance right, there'll be rules that are created that are not going to allow for innovation in the way that we need to. That again, knowledge and creativity is going to be more walled, rather than being more open to be freely shared, built upon, because no knowledge comes out of nowhere. All knowledge is built on knowledge of the past. All creativity is built on previous creativity. So how do we get that balance right? And I think there's an education bit to this. I think there's also about practically showing how things work to the benefit of the individual as well as a community, both at a local, you're working that in the Pennsylvania state level, but you're also looking at it at a nation state, international level. So there's just how do you get that balance? And I think that's what everyone's trying to grapple with, both the accountability, responsibility piece, but also ensuring innovation happens.
I think one way to grapple with that, I completely agree, is that government can realize that not only is trust in government at like a crazy all-time low, but certainly if one was to pull like trust in government as technologists, I think that would be in the negatives, right? People don't want their government to pretend to be experts in this. And for the most part, they're not. But what government can do, I really think, is govern these technologies effectively and say that we are going to understand how we use them. We're going to set human-centered values. We're going to work with organized labor to do these things, but we are not going to put ourselves in the position of, you know, many of you guys in this room. I think by concentrating on governance and sticking to core values, there is a way for us right now to assuage some of those fears. That said, it's sort of like, you know, the solution for 61% of people in this country thinking that AI is going to destroy humanity. I mean, I would love a solution for that. Like, it's a really big one. So we can only really do step by step. Yeah.
For those people who you talk to who are fearful, particularly of blockchain and crypto, I always am able to stop those folks in their tracks when I ask them if they know how private their dollar is, their fiat dollar, their credit card statements, their transactions on Amazon. Everybody thinks, oh, well, the government doesn't have access to that. Legal process, it gives them access to that. So I understand the fear, but I think it's born more out of a misunderstanding of the technology and the fact that you can be eminently creative with it. We talked about the programmable blockchains. You can be creative with it. So instead of telling people, oh, it does just this thing, when you tell folks it can do anything that you want it to do or design it to do, that's kind of a hard idea for non-technology folks to grasp, particularly when it comes to something as important as their money.
Yeah. And I think what they've seen with social media, all the data gathering, you know, that they've gone, okay, what all can somebody know about me? And do I want the government to know all this about me? And speaking of that, in regulations, I mean, where are we in the US with blockchain and regulations and technology? I feel like the SEC has just been so aggressive lately. And I mean, what needs to be done in order to allow this innovation to take place, but yet make sure that it's regulated in a way that we don't have some of the corruption?
Yeah,
I'll be a little contrarian and say if any of us put ourselves in Gary Gensler's seat, would you make any different decisions? We might not be as aggressive as the SEC has been under our leadership, but you've got to understand his responsibility. So I'm sympathetic with him, but I wish he were more like the governor and leaned a little bit more forward to say, hey, look, if I see these problems with different technologies, I'm going to reach out to industry and say, look, if you want this to be more popular and to be regulated differently, show me.
Yeah.
Show me the use cases. Bring it to me. I'm happy to cooperate. Not that he is, but I think that's what they lack.
Well,
But I am sympathetic to the resistance from a regulator perspective.
he was a professor of blockchain at MIT. He knows this technology. So I'm kind of surprised at some of the moves he's made. Go ahead.
I mean, I'm obviously very biased, but I think states are totally underutilized and underrated as like test labs and case studies for pilots. States are in a position where they can work with vendors and technologists to give them literal funding, almost like their own private VC. Public VC, almost like their own VC organization, to see if these tools can help their goals, can help their accomplishments. So I would love to see more investment in states where things can both go quicker, where there's frankly less regulation, so there's a little bit more room to play, as opposed to the federal government where it just takes so long to do anything, and it's just hard.
And you've got an opportunity next year because it's the year of elections, not just in the US, but globally. I don't think there's ever been so many elections.
4 billion people will be voting next year, I just read, in 2024. It's not half the planet.
Yeah.
So it's a major direction of where the world's going to go next year.
Yeah, and it's been really heartening to see Congress really moving on this. We recently saw a very important bill get out of the House Financial Services Committee and go to the floor for a vote, which is really huge progress. And I think many members of Congress have been extremely thoughtful about these technologies for a long time. And finally, seeing actual movement has been very, very heartening. And I thought, what you said, Annie, about states and local government is actually a really great point. One of the things we've been doing at Filecoin Foundation is there are actually a lot of government data sets, including at the local level, that are stored on the Filecoin network. So using the Filecoin network to actually preserve government data to make sure that when you have things like one example, what Catherine was talking about earlier, with climate data sets being available to the public, when there was a regime change to a certain administration, EPA data sets just suddenly were wiped off of all the government websites, right? And those are actually backed up by the Internet Archive, and the Internet Archive has been partnering with us to create what we call Democracy's Library, where we're storing government data sets on the Filecoin network to preserve it into the future.
Marta's comment just sparked another thought. So just think back, if you can, to the birth of the internet and what policy and regulatory actions were taken to encourage the growth of the internet. Yes. Now, we can have an argument about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, but it might not be right now, but it was correct at the time. And that's the kind of regulation that I would like to see around blockchain and other technologies, something to really kickstart the development and the private sector engagement with it. And then maybe if we need to change in the future because something gets out of hand, well, then by all means, let's do it. But in order to maintain leadership, let's do some things that let the private sector brilliance really accelerate the development.
Yeah, and I guess the internet was created by the Department of Defense, right? Blockchain was created by Satoshi Nakamoto, so maybe that has something to do with kind of the support that went into it. And I do want to leave some time for questions, maybe about 10 minutes if we can. So we just got a few more minutes. So just, if you can give your best guess a timetable.
Oh God.
Like, when might we see blockchain becoming more mainstream and something that people interact with on a daily basis?
I mean, I think in like the next 8 years, which feels too long, but I think aggressive governments and aggressive orgs will find successful use cases within the next 8 years, within the next like 1 to 2 administrations that actually bring it to a consumer's desk. I also think there's a parallel here that like misinformation is such a threat to democracy, such a threat to all of our governments, that there's a real government imperative to use these technologies to better combat it. I think if it is able to speed past that timeline, it'll be because of like a citizen detective type of initiative.
Yeah. I really like the narrative that you used there, because I think that storytelling around that is going to be super important to cut that 8 years. And that's going to be interesting, because often it's events, isn't it, that spark something that ends up in different ways. And I think that you could see something happening where the use case is so clear, that the takeoff and the public backing is much stronger. Don't know when that's going to be, but you never know. So
I'm always shocked when there are polls about how many people actually hold cryptocurrency in the US. It's really surprising to see, and the numbers, and especially to see how it breaks down along a variety of different diversity metrics. It's super, super interesting stuff. So I would say, I think in a lot of ways it's already here. I would also say this technology is a little different from like the internet, in that it's not something that it's much more of like a lower level in the technology stack kind of technology often. And so sometimes when you're buying and selling cryptocurrency, sure, you're directly interacting, with blockchain technology. But I think, again, a huge part of blockchain technology is that it really just enables you to program your money and to do cool things that enable you to make financial transactions in a really seamless way, in a way that you might not even realize has anything to do with blockchain.
Yeah.
And that's really, I think, where we can succeed when people are interacting with it on a day-to-day basis without really even realizing it.
So I'll give you a vague and ambiguous answer by saying just soon. But understand that going beyond blockchain, this example includes blockchain. But is anyone familiar with Bellingcat? Anyone follow the Bellingcat investigations? So what I love about Bellingcat is they're using these technologies now to do these private sector investigations, like the July 2014 shoot down of the airliner over Eastern Ukraine. Yeah. They were able to do remarkable work using AI and blockchain information. So one, it's already being used at a level that we probably don't even know. I'm very amused by headlines that contradict each other. No financial institution, no traditional financial institution will hold any kind of cryptocurrency. The next headline, oh my gosh, we've just taken a major stake in cryptocurrency. So when people say, oh, this is fraudulent, it's all illicit transactions, no one believes in this stuff, I say, well, major financial institutions are holding lots of digital assets right now. So I would say soon, because we're seeing, I personally believe that we're seeing lots of growing momentum, because interest is growing and the problems are static. The problems that these technologies solve still exist. So people will always migrate towards solutions.
That killer app, that ChatGPT killer app, we still kind of need. I would love to get a few questions. I believe we have about 9 minutes left. Anybody have any questions for the panelists? Okay, so let's start with you, and then we'll go to you. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I just have one question, Marta.
Oh, we've got a mic. I think, yeah, here we go.
Marta said that one of the challenges is, that people equate blockchain as Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. And I do have personally faced it. So how do we overcome the other challenges? How do you overcome this mindset block that people have?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's really honestly one of the fundamental communication issues here is there are a lot of really great financial use cases of blockchain. And I don't want to, put those aside too much, because those are also great use cases. But I think people don't even realize the extent to which this technology is being utilized, far beyond what they think about in the financial sector. So just the Filecoin network, if you're just looking at Filecoin, what we're doing is we're basically we're like Airbnb for file storage. And so we're using the ability to program your money for people to basically be able to rent their storage on other people's computers. So we create this decentralized file storage network. And we have a massive amount of data that's stored on the Filecoin network that I think a lot of people would be shocked to see. So things like government data sets. We're working with Lockheed Martin Space on demonstrating how the technology helps with long distance networking in space. We have all sorts of environmental use cases and just tons of data. So it's really a communications issue, really getting out there that this isn't theoretical. It's not something that's in the future. There is real use now of this technology, and Filecoin is obviously just one example, or many blockchain use cases that are not just purely financial, and it's a matter of communicating that out.
I'd also add, like in terms of communication to government specifically as well, I think so much of that comes through policy right now. It comes through like policymakers, it comes through policy in different agencies, all of which is totally great. But it is worth, I think, pushing it towards an information technology and a more action digital services focused lens as well. Those are the people with the immediate ability to like execute those technologies. And I think execution is what is able to bring in that executive buy-in. So I would just kind of throw that as, I think, as we think as organizations, like how do we embed policy fellows and all these really amazing things that we benefit from very much in the governor's office? Can we put them in more action-focused executable roles?
Yeah, I had a question. So, I think a lot of times I get asked the question, about the technology, and I say, well, do you know how HTTPS works, right? I mean, I don't know, but I have my phone and I know that works. So that often, quiets people down. My question is similar. Here we are at a very large institution. We've had a lot of institutional players come today to talk about the technology. Everyone in this room, I'm sure, is, fairly advanced in their understanding. How do we get this down to the grassroots? How do we get communities, right, and people who are working and living in ethnic communities, and I know there are some demographics related to that, but how do we get people to really say, this is happening, understand the technology from a digital identity or whatever, come curious, right? How do we shift this paradigm and bring it really down to almost like a grassroots? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
We put together in the early days of our administration a group of just like really smart people, a lot of them in this room, who would just talk to us about AI and where things were. And one of the women on the panel was dead serious. We have like a very specific discussion, and like dead serious was like, you should make an AI mascot. And you should bring the mascot everywhere you go. And you should host listening sessions with the mascot. And the mascot should be like purple and pink, like a little blockhead, like a little Duolingo bird. And I actually thought that was an amazing idea, but and I loved it. But I think we need to kind of treat it like any other, PR or marketing campaign. Like, it is very, very complicated. It also affects people's lives in a day-to-day. And I think the first and foremost thing is just for them not to be scared of it. And if that's through, a mascot, if that's through a more conventional listening tour, if that's through celebrity engagement, all those things really matter. So I think thinking about it like that as if it was its own campaign is worth doing.
And focus on the function. I love your example about HTTP. So none of us knows how, well, some of us do, but not a lot of us know the difference between the people who use the internet and understand how it works is vastly different. The same thing I think is happening or should happen here. Let's just focus on the benefits that it gives you, how it works. Well, we'll explain it to you if you want to know, but it'll go right over your head, but you'll still keep using it. ATMs were the same way. The internet was the same way. Even mobile phones. Very, very steep adoption rate, but people cared about what it did, not how it did it.
Yeah. And Mark started by talking about trust, right? And so when we trust, if we go out for a meal, that the chef will make something for us and we will have our meal. We don't go in and say, let's see each thing. We trust that system of food regulation and all of those things. And I think there's something there about how do we put our trust in some things that we don't understand. And it goes back to what we were saying about the moral panic, the fearfulness around some of those things. So there's ways to do, education's one of them, explainability, accountability. But I think it's also about time as well. As people see these use cases and see the benefits for themselves, then it becomes much easier to explain why this is important in our day-to-day life. Sorry, Marta. Yeah. Mascots. Sorry, Annie. Mascots.
I would also say, one of the things that's really interesting, sounds like my tech. There we go. One of the things that's really interesting about my They're like, you know what? The panel's over. We're just going to turn off our mic. We've heard enough from Marta today. Okay, so one of the things that's really interesting when you talk to different groups is sometimes you're really surprised at the people who get it immediately. For example, I think we're in a really privileged position in the US to really be able to trust central intermediaries and never have had to have questioned that. But I met someone who told me a story about, not in the US, running through the grocery store, literally running because the prices would be different if you waited 5 minutes, right? Like literally running to the grocery store in a state of hyperinflation. So I think actually all over the world, a lot of people get this quite quickly. And we're in a place where we I think in the US, really can trust centralized institutions and maybe don't understand it as fast.
I kind of thought, because my core business is local TV news that I do from the NASDAQ for TV stations around the country, even though I do a lot of crypto, blockchain, and things as well. But I know one thing that rates really high for local news is food recalls.
Yeah.
And like it just spikes up and people are very interested in it. And I thought if there was a way, because I know Walmart had implemented blockchain technology for food recalls. And I thought there's ever some spinach recall or something where we could say in the news, blockchain traced it right to that farm in 2 seconds.
Yeah.
Versus where it is now, like, well, we think it came from Santa Clara County and we're not sure where, and 2 months down the road, maybe we'll find out. Meanwhile, throw away all your spinach or something. So if we could get a killer use case like that the public could understand, I think would go a long way in advancing blockchain. So I think we're about done, or yeah, we're pretty much done. So thank you guys so much. So interesting. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you, Jean.
Okay.